I think eventually you're going to see a Mag 7 company own substantial amounts of Bitcoin on their balance sheet. These are tech adjacent firms. Maybe it's not Microsoft, maybe it's Meta, maybe it's another firm, but I think you're going to start to see this happen. This has gone from a sort of crazy idea that only Mako Saylor was doing to an idea that now dozens of companies are doing. I think it will be hundreds of companies, and I think they'll be buying hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin per year. It's sort of another source of insatiable demand for Bitcoin.
There is no doubt that 2024 marked a pivotal year for Bitcoin adoption. Not only did we see increased institutional adoption through iBit and other spot Bitcoin ETFs, but several firms, in and out of the United States, also adopted MicroStrategy's Bitcoin strategy model, buying thousands of the leading cryptocurrency to put on their balance sheet instead of depending on easily inflated fiat currencies like the US dollar. MicroStrategy itself rapidly ramped up its Bitcoin purchases during the year. According to data from BitBo, the software and business intelligence firm increased its Bitcoin holdings from 132,500 Bitcoin in December 2023 to 446,400 Bitcoin by December 30th, 2024. During the year, we also saw a lot of discussion and some activity regarding one or more of the Magnificent Seven adopting Bitcoin. In December 2024, Microsoft shareholders voted against a proposal to add Bitcoin to the company's balance sheet. The proposal, titled Assessment of Investing in Bitcoin, was submitted by the National Center for Public Policy Research, advocating for Bitcoin as a hedge against inflation and a means to diversify Microsoft's assets. Microsoft's board of directors recommended rejecting the proposal, emphasizing the company's existing diversified investment approach and expressing concerns over Bitcoin's volatility. They stated that Microsoft's management already evaluates a wide range of investable assets, including Bitcoin, as part of its broader investment framework. Despite the proposal's rejection, the discussion highlighted a broader debate on the role of cryptocurrencies in corporate finance. Advocates pointed to companies like MicroStrategy, which holds a substantial amount of Bitcoin, as examples of successful corporate adoption. For staunch Bitcoin bulls like Michael Saylor and Bitwise CIO Matt Hougan, it's only a matter of time before more multi-billion-dollar corporations, and eventually a trillion-dollar company, adopt the Bitcoin standard, opening the floodgates for more adoption in and out of the United States. The Bitwise CIO discusses his expectations for Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other digital assets in a recent interview with Mr. M podcast. As we bring you clips from the interview, please take a little time to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notifications for more videos like this. Thanks for the support and enjoy the video.
You take the best performing financial asset of all time, which is Bitcoin, and you take a 10-year delay for demand to build up, and a huge audience of people who don't feel comfortable buying Bitcoin any other way. And you put them together and it's just a spectacular result. Of course, there were other elements, right? There was what was going on with MicroStrategy pushing prices higher. There was what was going on with the US election pushing prices higher. But there was just huge pent up demand. The thing I always come back to is the vast majority of investors still have zero exposure to Bitcoin. That has to change. Right? Most investors are going to end up owning Bitcoin. The ETF was the first release valve to see that happen, and that led to this spectacular result. If you look at most ETFs globally, they vary by ETF, but it's fairly typical to have about half from retail and half from institutional. And that's the direction of travel we're seeing on these Bitcoin ETFs. You're seeing the share of institutional demand tick up a little bit. We're still in the high 70s on retail, but I think that will really start to change when we get the Q4 numbers. You get those reporting about 6 weeks in arrears. So we'll get the Q4 numbers in mid-February. I think you'll start to see it more like 75-25. And then over the course of the year, that's going to balance out more towards 50-50. The important thing there is that what that tells you is we've set these records and the real institutional demand has only just started to trickle in. So it tells you that this inflow has a long way to go. I expect the $40 billion we see to be eclipsed significantly in 2025. I expect more inflows in 2025 than 2024. And it's because those institutions are really going to start to buy in mass. These demand curves are exponential, which means even in the early phases when they're building, you barely notice because it's going from a few million to like maybe 5 or 6 million. You start to see it, and then it escalates like that. And that's what we're going to see on Ethereum. There are a couple reasons for that. One is that, as you know, whenever an investor comes into crypto through Bitcoin, it sort of marinates for a while, and then they start to learn more about crypto. And then 6 to 12 months later, they buy Ethereum and other altcoins. That's happened for 15 years in crypto. And of course, it's going to happen with ETFs. So you get this echo boom. But I'm also just organically excited about where Ethereum is and where it's going in 2025. I think the setup is extremely strong to benefit from agentic AI, to benefit from stablecoin demand, to benefit from tokenization. All of those play directly into Ethereum, more so than any other programmable blockchain. So I think there's both this sort of natural increase in demand for the ETF, and then these huge catalysts from what I expect to happen in 2025. So I'm really bullish on ETH inflows in 2025.
Are you expecting an index, for example, an ETF, which has a bunch of different cryptos coming in?
Long term, that's where most of the demand is going to be. If you look in the traditional sort of equity space, people don't buy one stock. They tend to buy an index fund. That's going to be true in crypto as well. There have been a couple products. Bitwise has an application, which I can't speak to specifically, but there have been a couple filings to launch these index-based ETFs. You got to remember, most traditional investors don't live in this world like I do. They think about crypto, a few minutes a week. They just want exposure. And for these people, an index-based products that'll be mostly Bitcoin, some Ethereum, and then some exposure to Solana and other altcoins will be the perfect product for them. And I think they'll attract tens of billions of dollars of inflows over time. One of the biggest trends last year was corporations buying Bitcoin. MicroStrategy gets all the press, but there are dozens of companies beyond MicroStrategy that are moving on to this sort of Bitcoin standard of keeping their corporate treasury in Bitcoin, both public companies and then of course private companies as well, like Bitwise. But we, think there is demand to invest in these companies that recognize that holding traditional cash on a balance sheet is a losing proposition, right? Fiat currency loses value over time. So why do America's public companies and the world's public companies hold trillions of dollars in an asset that is depreciating over time? The smarter companies are moving on to this Bitcoin standard. So without talking about, again, the specific filing, which we made, and you can see at the SEC site, we think there is substantial demand to invest in these Bitcoin standard style companies. And we think it's a real differentiating factor, right? I think these are companies that get it. They see what's happened with the money printing. They see what's happening with fiat currencies worldwide. They're opting out of it onto a Bitcoin-based treasury strategy. And we think, though, those kind of companies will be rewarded in the future. Yeah, I think it's important for people to realize who aren't in the traditional equity world that voting in traditional stocks is not like voting in crypto. Voting in crypto has real community engagement. People are engaged. They think about it. Most voting in the traditional equity world uses these proxy voting providers who are institutional consultants, the most TradFi of TradFi institutions as well. So when you see a vote like that, you shouldn't interpret it as actual Microsoft's shareholders only 0.5%. It's really that the institutional capital outsources voting, and these TradFi suits just reflexively vote with the company. I think eventually you're going to see a Mag 7 company own substantial amounts of Bitcoin on their balance sheet. These are tech adjacent firms. Maybe it's not Microsoft, maybe it's Meta, maybe it's another firm, but I think you're going to start to see this happen. This has gone from a sort of crazy idea that only Michael Saylor was doing to an idea that now dozens of companies are doing. I think it will be hundreds of companies, and I think they'll be buying hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin per year. It's sort of another source of insatiable demand for Bitcoin. I think people have underestimated the degree of this change, right? I mean, crypto has been seen in a negative light by governments for the last decade. It's been fighting uphill, and it's not just gotten to neutral. It's gotten to overtly positive. You mentioned Of course, the Trump takeover has its own crypto czar. And in Canada, as you mentioned, the leading candidate is overtly pro-Bitcoin. Canada was like the anti-Bitcoin a few years ago. You remember the trucker protests and all of that. And now to see a potential prime minister who is pro-Bitcoin, I think people have dramatically underestimated the scale of this. I would also add there's this question of whether we'll see governments around the world starting to add Bitcoin to their own balance sheets. I would say that that possibility is not priced into the market at all, like zero. If that becomes a reality, I think you're talking about Bitcoin being many hundreds of thousands of dollars. There's just not enough Bitcoin in the world to support to facilitate that kind of demand without prices going substantially higher. So I think this is a real sea change. I think investors have underestimated it. I think it's going to have a long tail effect. It'll extend the bull market substantially in 2025 and potentially beyond.
The U.S. Department of Justice, DOJ, has announced plans to sell approximately 69,370 bitcoins, valued at around $6.5 billion, which were seized from the Silk Road darknet marketplace. This decision follows a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that rejected an appeal challenging the government's ownership of these assets, thereby authorizing the DOJ to proceed with the sale. The DOJ's planned liquidation of these seized bitcoins has generated significant discussion within the cryptocurrency community. Some analysts express concern that introducing such a large volume of Bitcoin into the market could impact its price. Additionally, there is speculation about how this action aligns with potential future policies, especially considering statements from political figures like former President Donald Trump, who has indicated plans to establish a U.S. Bitcoin reserve if re-elected. In a recent tweet, Hougan underplays the impact of this sale, noting that there are ready buyers available to swoop up the Bitcoin. His post reads, "If the U.S. government actually sells $6.5 billion worth of Bitcoin in the waning days of the Biden administration, the market will hoover it up and the new administration will buy it back." This statement perfectly demonstrates Hougan's bullish expectations for Bitcoin in 2025 and beyond. Here are more clips from the interview.
The Bitcoin network is going to produce about 160, 170,000 Bitcoin next year. Corporations bought 270,000 last year. ETFs bought 500,000. Governments are talking about buying hundreds of thousands. Any one of these sources is more than all the net new Bitcoin that comes out of the market. And that means, just from a simple perspective, that in order to satisfy that demand, which I think is unstoppable, I think you're going to see all three sources buy hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin. People who hold Bitcoin today have to sell. Maybe they're willing to sell at $100,000, but if they're not, what is the next level at which enough of them will sell? Is it 125? Is it 150? Is it $200,000? I think the market could sort of find itself in an air gap where people are unwilling to sell until it gets to a new major level. And that move could be very violent. You might remember last year, we bumped around the all-time high at like $72,000 for 6 or 7 months. And then when we broke through it, straight to 100, right? I think you could have an element like that here as well. We're hovering around $100,000, but if we get above it, straight to something, I don't know what that something is, but there is just too much demand, not enough supply, and the only solution to that is higher prices. I think that's what we're going to see in 2025. Look, I think if we get 10 or 20% above $100,000, people are going to assume that there is a sort of black hole pulling Bitcoin up to $200,000. I think when you think about this market where there's a fundamental mismatch of net new demand versus net new supply, and that has to be filled by people willing to sell, I think you have to think about behavioral cliffs. Who's going to sell at $117,000, right? No one is sitting at home on their sofa right now thinking, well, when it gets to $117,000, I'm going to sell. They're either thinking, I'm going to sell here at 100, or maybe I'm going to sell at 150, but probably I'm going to sell at 200 or 250. And I just think once we get sort of out of this center of gravity at $100,000, there is just this rush, as you said, people FOMOing in until it gets to, my guess is 200, it could be 250, maybe it's 150, but I suspect it's in that 200 zone. I've seen a lot of forecasts in and around $200,000. Bitwise said, we think Bitcoin will get above $200,000. I think 250 is definitely possible. That's a psychological number. And I think it could happen very fast. Look, the reason I think we have cycles is because in a bullish market, leverage builds up in the ecosystem, and then people do crazy things, and then that has to be washed out. I mean, you can make much more specific arguments for the 2022 bear market or 2018, but generally speaking, that's the vibe. Bull, leverage, insanity, washout. If we start ripping to 200K, we're going to have people that get over levered. We're going to have people who do wild things. We're going to have silly projects that are fraudulent. And that tells me that at some point we'll have a washout. Will it drop from 200 to 100? I don't think so. But if we went to 200, could we pull back 30%? Of course we could, right? Of course we could. We haven't repealed human nature. But I do think the winter, if it happens, will be much, much shallower. It'll be like a global warming winter. It's going to happen over the course of a few months because you have these long-term bullish trends that are going to play out over years. Institutions are going to be moving into Bitcoin for the next 5 years. And so even if we have this blow off of leverage that leads to a significant pullback, it's going to be picked up by these long-term trends that I don't think are going anywhere. So we haven't repealed the 4-year cycle, but we've probably shallowed it and shortened it. And what that means for investors, I mean, from my perspective, is just ignore it. Just buy Bitcoin and hold it, and you'll be fine. It's impossible to time these things, but be aware that there's going to, yes, of course, at some point, leverage will build up and it'll get flushed out. It's going to happen. But that doesn't mean that we've repealed the bull market.
In addition to Bitcoin, Hougan is also bullish on other top cryptocurrencies, including Ethereum and Solana. His recent post on Ethereum reads, "People significantly underestimate how fast Ethereum Layer 2 transaction volume will grow. Imagine if this chart represented the cost of sending a text or email. Actually, we know what cost compression did to texting. In 2005, it cost $0.20 to send a text, and US users sent 81 billion texts. By 2011, the average cost was $0, and users sent 2.3 trillion texts, a 28-fold increase. Of course, there were UX improvements on texting in the intervening time period, but the same is true for Layer 2 transactions. The numbers are going to get really big, really fast." Independent Bitcoin on-chain analyst Willy Woo has also issued a bullish but cautious update for 2025. According to Woo's post, we might see a bit more selling and consolidation for a few more weeks before the reset is complete. Woo's post reads, "Bitcoiners, sentiment seems uber bullish, but I say take a cautious approach in the months ahead. Risk is peaking for the first time in this cycle, and there's a ton of profit in coins that have been selling and plenty more profit taking to go before we are properly reset." Do you agree with Woo's bullish but cautious approach to Bitcoin in the coming months? Please drop your replies and comments on Matt Hougan's super bullish analysis in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video and want more content like this, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notifications for more videos like this. Thanks for watching.